The Haunting of Blackthorn Light, a tale of isolation and terror. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lucas, and today I'm sharing a story that's kept me up at night ever since I heard it. It comes from my uncle Marcus, a former Coast Guard officer who spent over 20 years serving on the rugged coasts of the Pacific Northwest. Marcus isn't the type to spin tall tales. He's a no-nonsense guy, practical, level-headed, and not one for ghost stories or superstition. But when he told me this story back in 2023, his voice shook in a way I'd never heard before. I've asked him to repeat it multiple times, and the details never change. This is the story of what happened to him in 2019 at a remote lighthouse called Blackthorn Light off the coast of Oregon. Buckle up, because this one's long, unsettling, and unlike anything I've ever shared before. If you like it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. The assignment. It was late spring of 2019, and Marcus was assigned to Blackthorn Light for a week-long maintenance rotation. Blackthorn Light sits on a desolate rocky outcrop about 2 hours by boat from the mainland. It's a barren place, just a craggy island, barely 200 feet across, with nothing but the lighthouse, a small storage shed, and a rusted fuel tank. No docks, no power grid, no Wi-Fi, and barely any cell signal. The lighthouse itself is automated, but it still needs periodic checks to ensure the beacon and backup systems are functional. Normally, it's a solo job, but after some unexplained equipment failures the previous year, the Coast Guard decided to send 2 people, Marcus and a younger officer named Elena. Marcus had done dozens of these assignments before. He described Blackthorn Light as a relic, a 70-foot tower built in the late 1800s, with a spiral staircase leading to a beacon room encased in thick, salt-encrusted glass. The auxiliary shed held a diesel generator, some tools, and emergency supplies. The island was exposed to brutal winds and waves, and the nearest help was hours away. For Marcus, it was just another job. He packed his gear, work tools, a sleeping bag, some canned food, and a deck of cards, and boarded the Coast Guard cutter with Elena. The first 3 days were uneventful. The weather was cold and overcast, but calm. Marcus and Elena spent their days checking the beacon's gears, testing the emergency batteries, and scrubbing corrosion off the metal railings. The work was tedious, checking bolts, oiling mechanisms, and logging data. At night, they'd eat simple meals like beans and rice, play cards in the cramped sleeping quarters at the base of the tower, and listen to the wind howl outside. The isolation was intense, but it was part of the job. Marcus said Elena was a good partner, quiet but efficient, with a dry sense of humor that made the long days bearable. On the 4th night, things took a turn. Marcus woke up around 3 a.m. feeling off. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't pain or sickness, but a strange heaviness in the air, like the pressure you feel before a storm. He lay still, listening. The lighthouse was silent, which was wrong. The beacon's rotation usually produced a faint hum, but there was nothing. He got up and checked the window. The sweeping beam that should have been cutting through the darkness was gone. The lighthouse wasn't working. He woke Elena, and they grabbed their flashlights and climbed the narrow, creaking spiral staircase to the beacon room. When they reached the top, they found the problem. A thick, damp piece of fabric was jammed into the beacon's rotating gears. It looked like an old canvas sail, tattered and coated in a slimy, greenish muck that smelled like rotting fish and seaweed. Marcus said it was heavy, like it had been soaked in seawater for weeks. They were baffled. The beacon room door had been locked, and the windows were sealed tight. No birds, no wind. Nothing could have carried it inside. They yanked the fabric free, tossed it over the cliff into the ocean, and restarted the beacon. They checked the locks and went back to bed, chalking it up to a freak accident. Maybe some old debris had been left in the tower and worked its way into the gears, but Marcus said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The second incident. The next night it happened again. Marcus woke up at 3:15 a.m. to the same eerie silence. The beacon wasn't turning. He and Elena climbed the stairs, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Sure enough, another piece of cloth was lodged in the gears, this time a frayed gray shawl soaked through and covered in tiny barnacles as if it had just been dredged from the ocean floor. The smell was worse, like decay and salt mixed with something sour. Marcus said it didn't make sense. The doors were still locked, the windows intact. They removed the shawl, threw it into the sea, and double-checked every inch of the tower. Nothing was out of place. Alina was rattled. She suggested someone might be pranking them, but Marcus pointed out the obvious. They were miles from civilization, alone on a rock in the middle of the ocean. No one could have gotten there without them noticing. They decided to secure the beacon room even more, wedging a metal bar against the door and piling crates at the base of the staircase to block access. They didn't sleep much that night. The unsettling shift. On the sixth night, things got weirder. Marcus was lying in his sleeping bag trying to rest when he heard Alina whispering. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it wasn't directed at him. She was facing the corner of the room, murmuring words he couldn't make out, like she was talking to someone. "Alina, you okay?" he called out. She stopped, turned to him, and blinked slowly, looking confused. "I wasn't saying anything," she said, her voice flat. Marcus didn't push it, but he felt a chill. Later that night, he woke to find Alina sitting by the window, staring down at the jagged rocks below. The beacon's light swept across the island, and she was fixated on something in the shadows. "What are you looking at?" Marcus asked. Alina didn't turn. "I thought I saw someone last night," she said quietly. "Down there on the rocks, just for a second when the light passed over. They were standing there watching us." Marcus looked out the window but saw nothing except the waves crashing against the rocks. He tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just a trick of the light, but he could tell she didn't believe him. From that point on, Alina started to change. She became withdrawn, barely speaking during the day. She'd spend hours staring out the window or listening to the walls, claiming she heard faint scratches or whispers from the stairwell. Marcus didn't hear anything, but he couldn't deny the growing sense of unease. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. He started to dread the nights. The breaking point. On the eighth night, Marcus was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase. They were slow and deliberate, coming from above, as if someone was walking down from the beacon room. He sat up, heart pounding, and saw Alina already awake, standing at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. "Did you go up there?" he whispered. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "Did you?" she asked. Neither of them had moved. They listened as the footsteps continued, one heavy thud after another, descending the metal stairs. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and shone it up the stairwell, but it was empty. The crates they'd piled at the base were still in place. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus and Alina didn't speak. They shoved a heavy toolbox against the bedroom door and sat in the dark, gripping their tools like weapons. The next morning they checked the tower. The crates were untouched, the beacon room door still barred. But the air felt wrong, like it was charged with static. Marcus noticed something else, a faint, damp footprint on the staircase, too small to belong to either of them. It was barefoot with a slight webbing between the toes, like it had been made by someone who just climbed out of the water. He didn't say anything to Alina, but he could tell she'd seen it too. The final night. On the ninth night, the beacon failed again. Marcus and Alina climbed the stairs, dreading what they'd find. The beacon room door, which they'd secured with a metal bar, was wide open, swinging in the wind. The beacon's massive bulb, industrial grade, requiring tools to remove, was unscrewed and placed in the center of the room, standing upright on its base. Next to it was a small, waterlogged object, a child's shoe, covered in moss and barnacles, like it had been submerged for years. Marcus said his blood ran cold. Alina was trembling, muttering under her breath. As they stood there, Marcus felt something brush against his leg, something cold and wet like a hand. He spun around, but the room was empty. Alina screamed, pointing at the wall. "It moved," she cried. Something came out of the wall. Marcus didn't see anything, but he grabbed her arm and pulled her down the stairs. They locked themselves in the sleeping quarters, barricading the door with everything they could find. Alina was unraveling. She sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, whispering to someone Marcus couldn't see. "They're here," she kept saying. They don't want us here. Marcus tried to stay calm, but he was terrified. He used the emergency satellite phone to call for an immediate pickup, claiming a critical equipment failure. The Coast Guard said they'd send a boat at first light, but that was hours away. Around 4 a.m., they heard it again. 3 slow knocks on the wall coming from inside the tower. Not the door, not the window, but the brick wall itself, as if someone was standing just behind it. Marcus gripped his wrench, his heart hammering. The knocks stopped, but the air grew colder and the smell of rotting seaweed filled the room. Elena was crying now, her flashlight shaking in her hands. The escape. When the boat arrived at dawn, Marcus and Elena were waiting on the rocky ledge, their bags packed. The crew noticed their pale faces and asked what had happened. Marcus said the lighthouse was unsafe and needed to be decommissioned. He didn't mention the footsteps, the cloth, or the shoe. But as they boarded the boat, one of the deckhands mentioned something that made Marcus's stomach drop. "We got a distress call from Blackthorn Light at 3:33 a.m., he said. It was garbled, just static, and a voice saying, "They're here. We thought it was you." Marcus hadn't touched the phone until morning. Elena just stared at the deck, silent. The ride back to the mainland was tense. Elena didn't speak, and when they reached the station, she requested a transfer and left the Coast Guard a few months later. Marcus never saw her again. The aftermath. Marcus filed a report stating that Blackthorn Light was structurally compromised and recommended it be sealed off. He never mentioned the strange occurrences, afraid he'd sound unhinged. He continued his Coast Guard duties but refused any assignments to Blackthorn Light. A year later, he retired early, saying he was done with remote postings. When I asked him what he thought was out there, he paused for a long time before answering. "Some places don't want you there," he said. "They've got their own history, and they don't like being disturbed." I tried to research Blackthorn Light myself, but there's little information available. County records mention a decommissioned lighthouse off the Oregon coast, but it's listed as restricted access with no further details. No history, no name, nothing. It's like the place doesn't exist. Marcus's notes from the assignment are vague, and he won't talk about it anymore. The last time I brought it up, he just said, "Leave it alone, Lucas. Some things are better left in the dark." That's the story of Blackthorn Light. I don't know what Marcus